A historic break, Venezuela changes the rules. Let me take you back to December 3, 2023. That was the day Venezuela held a referendum, one that barely made the front pages in the West, but one that, in my view, could end up being as consequential as the 2014 annexation of Crimea or the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. On the surface, it was just another exercise in Venezuelan 5 questions put to the people about the future of the Essequibo, a disputed territory controlled by Guyana but claimed by Venezuela for over a century. The official results? A staggering 95% in favor of annexation, with nearly 10.5 million voters participating. Caracas declared it a mandate to redraw the map, to create a new Venezuelan state in the Essequibo, and to issue oil and mining licenses in the region. The world, for the most part, shrugged. The U.S. State Department called it a threat to regional stability. Guyana appealed to the International Court of Justice. The UN issued a cautious statement. And that, most people assumed, was that. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying how great powers test the limits of the international order, how revisionist states exploit moments of distraction, and how seemingly minor territorial disputes become flashpoints for much larger conflicts. And what happened in Venezuela last December wasn't just another Latin American political stunt. It was a deliberate, calculated challenge to the post-Cold War settlement, a test of whether the United States and its allies still have the will, the capacity, and the unity to enforce the rules they've spent the last 30 years insisting everyone else follow. And if my reading of the situation is correct, we're witnessing the first real cracks in the unipolar moment since the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, let me be, I'm not saying Venezuela is about to invade Guyana tomorrow. That's not how these things work. What I am saying is that Nicolas Maduro has just done something far more dangerous than launching a military operation. He's changed the rules of the game. And if the West doesn't respond effectively, we're going to see a lot more of this, from Beijing in the South China Sea, from Moscow in the Baltics, from Tehran in the Persian Gulf. Because what Venezuela has just demonstrated is that the cost of revisionism is lower than it's been in decades. And that, my friends, is a problem. The official what they want you to believe. So let's start with the story the media has been feeding us. According to the Standard account, Venezuela's referendum was little more than a domestic political maneuver, a way for Maduro to distract from his country's economic collapse, to rally nationalist sentiment ahead of next year's elections, and to shore up his base after years of crippling U.S. sanctions. The Essequibo dispute, we're told, is a relic of colonial-era border agreements, a technicality that Guyana has every right to defend under international law. The U.S. and its allies have framed the crisis as a clear-cut case of a rogue state bullying a smaller neighbor, threatening to seize territory by force, and defying the rulings of the International Court of Justice. The solution, in this telling, is diplomatic pressure, targeted sanctions, and a show of military support for Guyana to deter further Venezuelan adventurism. The numbers seem to back this up. Guyana's economy is booming thanks to massive offshore oil discoveries by ExxonMobil, which began production in 2019. The country's GDP grew by an astonishing 62% in 2022, the fastest in the world, and is projected to grow another 38% this year. Venezuela, by contrast, is a basket case. Its economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless. Millions have fled the country. Maduro's approval ratings hover around 20%. So, the logic goes, of course he's trying to manufacture a crisis, because he has nothing else to offer his people. The U.S. has played its part in this narrative. In late November, just days before the referendum, the Biden administration announced a major military exercise with Guyana, including joint air and maritime patrols. The State Department has repeatedly affirmed its unwavering support for Guyana's territorial integrity. The UK, which once administered the Essequibo as part of British Guiana, has sent a warship to the region. And the International Court of Justice, in a preliminary ruling, has ordered Venezuela to refrain from any actions that would alter the status quo. On the surface, it all looks like business, as the US leading the charge to uphold international law, smaller nations banding together against a revisionist aggressor, the rules-based order holding firm. But here's the problem with this: it's incomplete. And in geopolitics, an incomplete story is often a dangerous one. The hidden facts behind the crisis. Let's start with the referendum itself. The official turnout figure, 10.5 million voters, is almost certainly inflated. Venezuela's last credible election, in 2015, saw about 7.5 million voters participate. Since then, the country's population has shrunk by at least 7 million due to mass emigration. Even accounting for some diaspora voting, the idea that 10.5 million people, more than half the country's remaining population, turned out for a non-binding referendum on a technical border dispute is, frankly, absurd. Independent observers, including the Venezuelan NGO Sumate, have raised serious questions about the numbers. The government, of course, dismisses these concerns as imperialist propaganda. But the pattern is in 2018, Maduro claimed 68% turnout in a presidential election that most of the world refused to recognize. The real number was likely closer to 30%. Then there's the question of what the referendum actually authorized. The government's official position is that it was a purely consultative exercise, a way to gauge public opinion. But the language of the questions was anything but neutral. The first question asked voters whether they rejected the 1899 Paris Arbitral Award, which settled the Essequibo dispute in Guyana's favor, and whether they supported the creation of a new Venezuelan state in the territory. The fifth question asked whether voters agreed to incorporate the Essequibo into Venezuela's national map. That's not a poll. That's a mandate for annexation. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The day after the referendum, Maduro signed a decree creating the Guayana Essequibo state, complete with a new governor and a plan to issue oil licenses in the disputed waters. He also ordered the State Oil Company, PDVSA, to begin exploration in the area. But, and this is crucial, he didn't order an invasion. Instead, he did something far more. He called for dialogue with Guyana, while simultaneously ramping up military exercises near the border. In other words, he's using the threat of force to extract concessions, not to launch a full-scale war. Why? Because Maduro is playing a long game. And to understand that game, you have to look at three things the mainstream media isn't talking: the role of China, the collapse of U.S. deterrence in Latin America, and the quiet but seismic shift in how the global South views the rules-based order. First, China. Venezuela owes Beijing at least $60 billion, most of it in oil-backed loans. For years, China has been patient, restructuring debt and accepting oil shipments in lieu of cash. But with Venezuela's production collapsing from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today, Beijing has grown increasingly frustrated. The Essequibo is a potential lifeline. The disputed waters are estimated to hold at least 11 billion barrels of oil, and Exxon's discoveries in Guyana's Stabroek Block have only raised the stakes. If Venezuela can force Guyana to the negotiating table, it could offer China a stake in the Essequibo's resources either through joint ventures or direct concessions. And China, which has already invested heavily in Guyana's infrastructure, would be more than happy to play both sides. Second, U.S. deterrence. For decades, the U.S. has treated Latin America as its backyard, intervening at will to remove leaders it didn't like: Arbenz in Guatemala, Allende in Chile, Noriega in AMA, Chavez in 2002, and, most recently, attempting to oust Maduro in 2019 with the farcical interim presidency of Juan Guaidó. But here's the: none of those interventions worked out the way Washington planned. Guatemala's coup led to decades of civil war. Chile's coup birthed Pinochet's dictatorship. AMA's invasion left a country in chaos. And Venezuela? The Guaidó gambit was a humiliating failure, leaving the U.S. with no credible opposition to Maduro and no leverage in Caracas. The message to the region's leaders has been the U.S. can't be trusted to follow through on its threats. And if you're Maduro, watching the U.S. struggle in Ukraine, withdraw from Afghanistan, and fail to deter China in the South China Sea, why would you believe that Washington has the stomach for a fight over a remote jungle territory? The military exercises with Guyana are a show of force, but they're also a sign of weakness. Because if the U.S. really wanted to deter Venezuela, it would have done more than send a few F-16s for a photo op. It would have imposed secondary sanctions on Chinese and Russian firms doing business with PDVSA. It would have offered Guyana a security guarantee. It would have made it clear that any move on the Essequibo would trigger a response. Instead, we got a strongly worded statement from the State Department. Which brings me to the third, and most important, the Global South's growing rejection of the rules-based order. For years, Western leaders have insisted that the post-World War II system, built on institutions like the UN, the ICJ, and the WTO, is universal, fair, and beneficial to all. But to much of the world, that system looks increasingly like a tool of Western dominance. The US and its allies write the rules, enforce them selectively, and ignore them when convenient. The Iraq War, the bombing of Libya, the recognition of Kosovo's independence, the US withdrawal from the JCPOA and the INF Treaty, all of these were violations of international law, but none were punished. Meanwhile, when Russia annexed Crimea, the West imposed crippling sanctions. When China built islands in the South China Sea, the US sent warships to challenge them. When Venezuela nationalized oil assets, the US froze its foreign reserves. The double standard is glaring. And Maduro knows it. That's why he's framed the Essequibo dispute not as a territorial grab, but as a struggle against imperialism. That's why he's gotten support from unexpected Brazil, which has its own border disputes with Guyana, has refused to condemn Venezuela. Colombia, under leftist President Gustavo Petro, has called for dialogue. Even Argentina, under the pro-Western Javier Milei, has avoided taking sides. And in the UN, while the US and its allies have rallied support for Guyana, the vote was far from unanimous. Many countries abstained or simply didn't show up. What's really happening here is that Venezuela is testing whether the Global South is willing to challenge the West's monopoly on defining what is and isn't acceptable in international relations. And so far, the answer may be. The exited geopolitical and multipolar world in the making. To understand why this matters, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture. We are living through the most significant shift in the global balance of power since the end of the Cold War. The unipolar moment, the brief period when the US stood alone as the world's sole superpower, is over. What's replacing it isn't bipolarity, like the US-Soviet standoff, but something far more: a multipolar world where power is diffused among multiple centers, each with its own sphere of influence, its own rules, and its own vision for the future. This isn't just academic theory. It's playing out in real time. In Europe, Russia is waging a war of attrition in Ukraine, betting that the West's resolve will crack before its own does. In the Middle East, Iran is extending its influence through proxies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, while Saudi Arabia hedges its bets by courting both Washington and Beijing. In Africa, Wagner Group mercenaries and Chinese infrastructure projects are displacing Western influence. And in Asia, China is building a parallel economic and security architecture, from the Belt and Road Initiative to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to counter US dominance. Venezuela's move on the Essequibo is part of this broader trend. It's a test case for how far a revisionist state can push before the US and its allies push back. And the early results are not encouraging for Washington. Let's talk about the three great powers and how they're playing this game. First, the United States. For the last 30 years, US grand strategy has been built on a simple that the world is safer when America is the sole superpower, when its alliances are strong, and when its adversaries are contained. This is the logic of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its unmatched power to spread democracy, free markets, and the rule of law. But there's a problem with this: it assumes that the rest of the world wants to live under a US-led order. And increasingly, it doesn't. The U.S. response to Venezuela's referendum has been a microcosm of its broader foreign policy dilemmas. On one hand, the Biden administration has tried to rally international support for Guyana, framing the crisis as a test of the rules-based order. On the other hand, it's been reluctant to take the kinds of actions that would actually deter Maduro, like imposing secondary sanctions on Chinese banks or offering Guyana a NATO-style security guarantee. Why? Because the U.S. is stretched thin. It's fighting a proxy war in Ukraine, managing a potential conflict with China over Taiwan, and trying to contain Iran's nuclear program. Venezuela is a distraction, not a priority. And that's exactly what Maduro is counting on. Second, China. Beijing has no interest in a Venezuelan invasion of Guyana that would disrupt its oil supplies and trigger a U.S. response. But it does have an interest in a weakened U.S. presence in Latin America, in a Venezuela that's dependent on Chinese investment, and in a Guyana that's open to Chinese influence. So what's China's play? It's hedging. It's maintaining ties with both countries, offering Guyana infrastructure loans while buying Venezuelan oil at a discount. It's positioning itself as the region's indispensable partner, the one country that can do business with everyone. And if Venezuela does manage to extract concessions from Guyana, say, a joint development deal in the Essequibo, China will be the first in line to profit. Third, Russia. Moscow's role in this crisis is more subtle, but no less important. Venezuela is one of Russia's few remaining allies in the Western Hemisphere, a client state that buys Russian arms, hosts Russian military advisors, and provides a foothold for Russian influence in the region. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of support for Maduro. In 2020, it deployed Wagner Group mercenaries to help prop up the regime. And in 2023, it's been quietly supplying Venezuela with drones and intelligence support. But Russia's real interest isn't in the Essequibo. It's in the erosion of U.S. influence in Latin America. Every time the U.S. fails to deter a revisionist state, whether it's Russia in Ukraine, China in the South China Sea, or Venezuela in the Essequibo, it sends a message to the rest of the U.S. as a paper tiger. And that's a message Moscow is all too happy to amplify. Now, let's talk about the historical parallels, because this isn't the first time a great power has tested the limits of the international order. In 1962, the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. The Kennedy administration responded with a naval blockade and a credible threat of war. The crisis was resolved when Khrushchev backed down, but not before the world came closer to nuclear war than at any time since. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, violating the post-Cold War settlement in Europe. The Obama administration responded with sanctions and military aid to Ukraine, but it stopped short of direct confrontation. The result? Russia got away with it. And 8 years later, it invaded Ukraine again, this time on a much larger scale. In 2012, China began building artificial islands in the South China Sea, turning reefs into military bases in violation of international law. The Obama administration responded with freedom of navigation operations, but it didn't challenge China's claims directly. The result? China now controls one of the world's most important waterways, and the U.S. is left playing catch-up. Venezuela's move on the Essequibo is following the same playbook. It's a low-cost, high-reward gamble. If the U.S. and its allies back down, Maduro gets to claim a victory for anti-imperialism and secure a new source of revenue. If they push back, he can frame himself as a David fighting Goliath, rallying nationalist sentiment at home and support from the global South. Either way, he wins. And that's the problem. Because in a multipolar world, the cost of inaction is just as high as the cost of overreaction. And right now, the U.S. is caught in the worst of both. It's not doing enough to deter Venezuela, but it's also not willing to accept that the rules of the game have changed. Military and strategic, the illusion of quick and easy. Now, let's talk about the military dimension of this crisis, because it's where the rubber meets the road. The U.S. has responded to Venezuela's referendum with a series of military exercises and deployments, but the truth is that the Pentagon is in no position to fight a war in South America. And that's a problem, because deterrence only works if your adversary believes you're willing to use force. Let's start with the facts on the ground. Guyana has no standing army to speak of, just a few thousand lightly armed troops. Its air force consists of a handful of helicopters and trainer aircraft that wouldn't last 5 minutes against Venezuela's Russian-made Su-30s or its aging but still formidable fleet of Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters. Guyana's navy is even more of a joke, a few patrol boats that would be outgunned by Venezuela's corvettes and fast attack craft. In a conventional conflict, Guyana would be overrun in days, if not hours. And that's before we even get to the fact that Venezuela has been quietly extending its military footprint in the region, including the reactivation of a Soviet-era radar station in the state of Bolívar, just miles from the Essequibo border. Now, what most people don't realize is that the U.S. military's ability to project power into South America has been hollowed out over the past 2 decades. The last time the U.S. conducted a major military operation in the region was Operation Just Cause in 1989, when 27,000 troops invaded AMA to remove Manuel Noriega. Since then, the Pentagon's focus has shifted to the Middle East, then to the Indo-Pacific, and now to Eastern Europe. The Southern Command, or Southcom, is the most neglected of the U.S. combatant commands, with a budget that's a rounding error compared to what's spent on CENTCOM or INDOPACOM. In 2023, Southcom's budget request was just $1.4 billion, less than what the U.S. spends on one Virginia-class submarine. And that's not just a funding issue, it's a strategic one. The U.S. has no permanent military bases in South America, no prepositioned stocks of equipment, and no rapid reaction force that could be deployed to Guyana in a crisis. The closest thing it has is the Fourth Fleet, which is essentially a paper command with a handful of ships that rotate through the region on an ad hoc basis. Let me explain why this matters. Deterrence isn't just about having the biggest stick, it's about having the credible ability to use it. And right now, the U.S. lacks that credibility in South America. Venezuela knows this. Maduro isn't stupid, he's a survivor who's spent the last decade outmaneuvering U.S. sanctions, coup attempts, and even an assassination plot. He understands that the U.S. is stretched thin, that its public is war-weary, and that its political class is too divided to rally around a new military commitment in a region that most Americans couldn't find on a map. So when the U.S. sends a few F-16s to Guyana for a joint exercise or deploys a destroyer to the Caribbean for a freedom of navigation operation, Maduro sees it for what it theater. Symbolic gestures that cost Washington nothing but mean even less to Caracas. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's move on the Essequibo isn't just about oil or territory. It's a test of U.S. resolve in a part of the world where Washington has long assumed it could dictate terms. And if Maduro gets away with it, it won't just be Guyana that pays the price. It'll be the entire Western Hemisphere. Because if Venezuela can redraw borders with impunity, why can't Nicaragua push into Costa Rica? Why can't Bolivia revive its claims on Chile's coastline? Why can't Argentina dust off its old maps and challenge the UK over the Falklands? The post-Cold War order in Latin America was built on the assumption that borders were sacrosanct and that the US would enforce that principle. But that order is crumbling, and Maduro is the one swinging the sledgehammer. And that brings me to the most dangerous part of this: the military escalation ladder. Venezuela has already begun mobilizing troops near the Essequibo border, and Guyana has responded by requesting military support from the US, the UK, and even Brazil. But here's the problem: none of these countries are prepared for a shooting war in the Guyana Shield. The US could, in theory, deploy Marines or Army units to Guyana, but doing so would require a massive logistical effort, and it would take weeks, if not months, to build up the necessary forces. Meanwhile, Venezuela could launch a lightning strike to seize key oil installations before the US could respond. And once those installations are in Venezuelan hands, the calculus changes. Because then you're not just talking about a border dispute, you're talking about a direct challenge to US energy interests in a region where China and Russia are already making inroads. Let's not forget that Venezuela is a Russian client state. Moscow has been propping up Maduro's regime for years, providing everything from military advisors to advanced air defense systems. In 2020, Russia even sent two Tu-160 strategic bombers to Venezuela as part of a training mission, a move that was as much about signaling to Washington as it was about supporting Maduro. If Venezuela invades the Essequibo, Russia will almost certainly provide intelligence, weapons, and even mercenaries, just as it did in Syria and Ukraine. And that complicates things for the US, because any military response would risk a direct confrontation with Russia in America's own backyard. That's a scenario that no US president wants to contemplate, especially not one who's already dealing with wars in Ukraine and Gaza. So what's the endgame here? The most likely outcome is that the US and its allies will try to contain the crisis through a combination of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and limited military support for Guyana. But that's not a strategy, it's a holding pattern. Because the real question isn't whether Venezuela will invade the Essequibo, it's whether the US is willing to accept that the rules of the game have changed. And if it isn't, then it needs to start preparing for a world where borders are no longer fixed, where revisionist powers can rewrite the map with impunity, and where the US is no longer the sole arbiter of global security. The problem is that the US is still operating under the assumption that it can have it both ways, that it can deter aggression without committing to a sustained military presence, that it can uphold the rules-based order without enforcing it. But that's not how geopolitics works. You don't get to pick and choose when to defend the system. Either you're all in, or you're not. And right now, the US is very much not all in. And that's why Venezuela's gamble might just pay off. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's move isn't just about the Essequibo, it's about the collapse of the domestic political order that has kept Maduro in power for over a decade. The regime is facing an existential crisis, and this isn't the first time it's turned to foreign adventurism to distract from internal decay. But this time, the stakes are higher, because the regime's survival is no longer just about economic mismanagement or repression. It's about whether Maduro can convince his own people, and more importantly, his own military, that he's still the man to lead Venezuela into a new era of nationalist revival. Let me explain why this matters. Since 2013, when Maduro inherited Chávez's revolution, Venezuela's economy has contracted by a staggering 75%. That's not a recession, that's a depression. Hyperinflation, once a distant memory for most of the world, became a daily reality for Venezuelans. By 2018, prices were doubling every 18 days. The bolivar became so worthless that people started using it as kindling or wallpaper. The minimum wage, which in 2012 could buy you a month's worth of groceries, by 2020 couldn't even cover a single cup of coffee. And yet, despite all this, Maduro has clung to power. How? Through a combination of brutal repression, electoral manipulation, and a carefully cultivated cult of personality around Chávez's legacy. But here's the uncomfortable: that playbook is running out of ink. The 2024 presidential election is supposed to be Maduro's moment of redemption. After years of being treated as a pariah by the West, he's managed to claw his way back into some semblance of international legitimacy. The US has eased sanctions in exchange for promises of free and fair elections, a deal that, as of this writing, looks increasingly shaky. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, has momentum. She won the primary in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote, a landslide that even the regime's most ardent supporters couldn't ignore. And yet, Maduro's response wasn't to negotiate. It was to ban her from running, just as he's banned or exiled every other credible opposition figure over the past decade. That tells you everything you need to know about his confidence in his own popularity. So what happens if the election is a sham? What happens if Machado is barred, the opposition boycotts, and Maduro declares victory with 30% turnout? The answer is that the regime's legitimacy, already threadbare, collapses entirely. And that's where the Essequibo comes in. For Maduro, this isn't just about territory. It's about creating a new narrative, one that frames him not as a failed socialist autocrat, but as a nationalist strongman reclaiming Venezuela's rightful place in the world. It's the same playbook Putin used in Crimea, the same one she is using in the South China Sea. You manufacture a crisis, you rally the people around the flag, and you hope that the international backlash is either manageable or, better yet, turns into a propaganda victory. But here's the: Venezuela's military isn't Russia's. It's not even Cuba's. It's a fractured institution, riddled with corruption, low morale, and deep divisions between the high command and the rank and file. The generals who prop up Maduro do so because they're getting rich off gold smuggling, drug trafficking, and sanctions evasion. The lower ranks? They're deserting in droves. Between 2016 and 2021, over 10,000 Venezuelan soldiers fled the country, many of them joining the exodus of over 7 million refugees. That's not a military that's eager to die for the Essequibo. And yet, Maduro is betting that a quick, decisive victory, even a symbolic one, will be enough to paper over those cracks. Let's game out the scenarios. The most likely outcome is that Venezuela stages a limited incursion, seizing a few border towns or key infrastructure like the Essequibo's oil fields, and then declares victory. The US and Guyana will scream, the OAS will condemn, and the UN will pass a resolution that no one enforces. Maduro will claim he's restored Venezuela's honor, and the international community will move on, just as it did after Russia's annexation of Crimea. But there are two wildcards here that could turn this into a much bigger crisis. The first is Guyana's response. Guyana is not Ukraine. It doesn't have a battle-hardened military or a population that's been preparing for war for a decade. But it does have something Venezuela doesn't: oil money. Since ExxonMobil's 2015 discovery, Guyana's GDP has grown by over 30% per year, making it the fastest-growing economy in the world. That money is buying F-16s, drones, and radar systems, tools that could make a Venezuelan invasion far costlier than Maduro anticipates. If Guyana puts up a fight, even a symbolic one, it could force the US to intervene more directly than it wants to. And that's where things get messy. The second wildcard is the Venezuelan opposition. Machado and her allies have been careful not to endorse the Essequibo gambit, but they haven't condemned it either. That's a calculated move. They know that if they oppose Maduro's nationalism too loudly, they'll be branded as traitors. But they also know that if the invasion goes badly, they can use it to argue that Maduro is leading Venezuela into another disaster. The real question is whether the military will fracture. If the generals start calculating that Maduro is more of a liability than an asset, they could turn on him. That's what happened in 2019, when Juan Guaidó briefly became the international face of the opposition with the backing of the US and over 50 other countries. The difference this time is that Maduro has Russia and China in his corner, and they're not going to let him fall without a fight. So where does that leave us? The most probable outcome is a frozen conflict, one where Venezuela holds onto some territory, Guyana refuses to recognize it, and the US imposes new sanctions that do little more than push Maduro closer to Moscow and Beijing. But there's a darker scenario, one where the invasion spirals out of control. Maybe Guyana's military resists more than expected. Maybe a US drone strike on Venezuelan positions, something that's already been floated by some hawks in Congress, escalates into a direct confrontation. Maybe the Venezuelan military, humiliated by defeat, turns on Maduro and plunges the country into civil war. None of these outcomes are likely, but none of them are impossible either. Here's the thing about geopolitical: they don't always pay off the way the gambler expects. Maduro thinks he's playing 4D chess, but he's really playing Russian roulette. The problem is that when a regime is as desperate as his, it doesn't have the luxury of playing it safe. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. Because in the end, the Essequibo isn't just about a piece of land. It's about whether the rules of the game have changed for good and whether the US and its allies are willing to accept that they've already lost. Now, what most people don't realize is that Maduro's gamble isn't just about territory, it's about rewriting the psychological contract between Venezuela and the international system. For decades, the US and its allies have operated under the assumption that rogue states will eventually fold under economic pressure, that sanctions will erode their legitimacy, and that military adventurism will be met with swift, decisive pushback. But what if none of that works anymore? What if the new rule is that the old rules no longer apply? Let me explain why this matters. The Essequibo crisis isn't just a border dispute, it's a stress test for the entire post-Cold War order. The US has spent the last 30 years acting as the world's policeman, enforcing red lines in the Balkans, the Middle East, and now Ukraine. But in Venezuela, we're seeing something: a country that has been economically strangled, diplomatically isolated, and yet still manages to punch above its weight. The sanctions regime against Venezuela is one of the most comprehensive in history, targeting everything from oil exports to gold sales to the country's access to the SWIFT banking system. And yet, Maduro isn't just surviving, he's escalating. That should tell us something. Here's the uncomfortable: the US and its allies are no longer the only players with the ability to rewrite the rules. Russia and China have spent the last decade building parallel institutions, the New Development Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, that allow them to operate outside the Western financial system. When the US cut Venezuela off from the dollar, Maduro didn't collapse. He pivoted to the yuan, the ruble, and even cryptocurrencies. When the US pressured India and Turkey to stop buying Venezuelan oil, they didn't comply, they just bought it at a discount and resold it. This isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the slow-motion fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocks. So what are the West's options? The first, and most likely, is to double down on containment. The US could impose secondary sanctions on any country that trades with Venezuela, effectively turning the country into a pariah state. But that's a risky move. Venezuela is a major oil producer, and if the US cuts off its supply, global energy prices could spike, something that would hurt American consumers just as much as it hurts Maduro. There's also the risk of pushing Venezuela even closer to Russia and China. We've already seen this play out in Syria, where Assad's regime survived because Moscow and Tehran were willing to prop it up. If the US tries to strangle Venezuela economically, Maduro will just lean harder on his patrons. The second option is to negotiate. The Biden administration has already signaled that it's open to talks, but the problem is that Maduro has no incentive to compromise. Why would he? He's already taken the Essequibo, and the international community hasn't done much to stop him. The last time the US tried to negotiate with Venezuela, in 2023, it offered sanctions relief in exchange for free elections. Maduro took the relief and then rigged the elections anyway. That's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. Maduro knows that the US is desperate for Venezuelan oil, and he's using that leverage to extract concessions. The third option is the most military intervention. Some hawks in Congress have already called for a show of force, arguing that the US should send warships to the region to deter further Venezuelan aggression. But that's a slippery slope. Venezuela has a population of 28 million people and a military that, while poorly equipped, is still capable of inflicting serious damage. The last time the US invaded a Latin American country, AMA, in 1989, it was a quick, decisive victory. But Venezuela isn't AMA. It's a country with a long history of guerrilla warfare, and if the US gets bogged down in a protracted conflict, it could become another Afghanistan or Iraq. Here's the thing about Grand: it's not just about what you want to happen, it's about what you're willing to accept. The US and its allies want Venezuela to back down, but they're not willing to pay the price to make that happen. They want Maduro to respect international law, but they're not willing to enforce it. And that's the real problem. Because in the absence of a credible deterrent, the rules of the game will keep changing, and not in the West's favor. Let me give you an example. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. The US and its allies imposed sanctions, but they didn't go to war. Why? Because Crimea wasn't worth the risk. But then, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the West responded with unprecedented military aid. The difference wasn't the territory, it was the perception of weakness. Putin saw that the West was willing to draw a line in the sand, and he tested it. Maduro is doing the same thing. He's testing whether the West is willing to defend its red lines in Latin America. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome is that the Essequibo crisis fizzles out, Venezuela holds onto some territory, Guyana protests, and the US imposes more sanctions that do little more than push Maduro closer to Moscow and Beijing. But the real damage won't be in the territory, it'll be in the precedent. Because if Maduro gets away with this, other leaders will take note. Bolivia might decide to reclaim its lost coastline from Chile. Nicaragua might try to annex Costa Rican territory. And the US will be left with to either accept that the rules have changed, or risk a series of endless, unwinnable conflicts. That's the thing about history. It doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. In the 1930s, the world watched as Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed the Sudetenland, and then took the rest of Czechoslovakia. The West didn't act because it didn't want to risk war. But by the time it did act, it was too late. I'm not saying Maduro is Hitler, or that Venezuela is Nazi Germany. But I am saying that when you let a leader rewrite the rules without consequences, you're not just dealing with one crisis, you're dealing with the next one, and the one after that. So what's the solution? The West needs to decide what it's willing to fight for. If the rules-based order is worth defending, then it needs to be defended with economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and, if necessary, military force. But if the West isn't willing to do that, then it needs to accept that the rules have already changed. Because in the end, the Essequibo isn't just about a piece of land. It's about whether the 21st century will be defined by the rule of law, or by the law of the jungle. And right now, the jungle is winning.